Alex Smith has had a big impact on the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes, and the Washington Redskins, and his recovery is something that we have to get into. Welcome back to RGR. Just a quick intro before we get right into the meat of what's going on. I'm Ryan, and this is my channel, Going Rogue, all about the NFL and the Kansas City Chiefs and things related to them. And this particular topic, Project 11 from Alex Smith's recovery from that fantastically broken lower leg, is something that we can't just ignore. And luckily enough, I was able to talk with Stephania Bell, ESPN senior writer and injury analyst, a certified PT, somebody that taught at KU. A lot of you may have run into her if you were in the sports program over there at any time. And she gave me a ton of time. We were able to get on a Zoom call. So you're going to see my end. You're going to hear Stephania, and we're going to go through a lot of the details about his injury and his recovery. And this all relates to a guy that really helped forge this Super Bowl team in Kansas City. So I wanted to give it its special due. So check this out. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Hit the sub and all that stuff. But let's listen to Stephania. We have something special for you, and I know for all of you in Kansas City as well as around the nation, you saw Project 11. I know what the ratings were in Kansas City in particular, and it's all because of Alex Smith. And luckily, we found time to get Stephania Bell from ESPN, their senior writer and injury analyst, in. Thank you for the time, Stephania.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm thrilled that people still want to talk about this piece, and I'm thrilled that it got such good reviews in Kansas City. I know Kansas City very fond of Alex Smith.
Yeah, it goes a long way. And it's such a great piece of work from so many different angles, but there's some things that I wanted to maybe follow up on, not just for Alex's future as you see it, but also some of the things that didn't make it into the show or things that maybe led to some other questions that I've gotten. And first, I'd like to start with Dr. West, who is the Redskins' official team physician. But a lot of folks were surprised at just how involved after the initial hospitalization, the rehab process that she was. Is that a common practice for team physicians that we just don't hear about? Or does Dr. West actually have something that goes beyond the normal practice?
Well, she has this really big heart. And
that helps.
Not to say that others don't, but I think she's a pretty unique individual. She and I have been friends through the sports medicine world before she was at Washington and I was at ESPN. And I think that, you know, she's got years of experience taking care of athletes. She was at Pittsburgh before. She worked as an assistant physician with the Steelers with Dr. Jim Bradley. And I did a feature on Dr. West. Robin, I'm accustomed to calling her, but I did a feature on Dr. West for ESPNW at Sports Center, because when she moved to Washington, and part of the reason she did was she had an opportunity to develop a practice there in an area that really needed something that she had to offer. And she became the head team physician for both the Washington Nationals and the Washington Redskins. So that she was the first woman to be a head team physician in two of the major four sports. So I think it speaks to her ability as an orthopedic surgeon. And I can't say what others would have done in that situation, but I think she views those athletes as her patients. And now, had it not been an orthopedic injury, I think she would have still taken an interest. I think she would have still been very involved and connected with the athlete. But in this case, orthopedic surgeon, orthopedic injury, she was in the OR with the trauma surgeons assisting, although they were the primary ones taking care of the fracture and the initial injury. But Alex was her patient. So she was very connected to his care, overseeing his care. But I think in terms of just the way she approached his care, I don't know that every physician would do the same thing. You would hope, because it's really, I think, what made Alex's recovery possible. But it was her idea to reach out to the folks in San Antonio, because she knew of the CFI and thought this injury that he had, and the way it evolved could really benefit from their expertise. So like no ego on her part, but instead of just sending him down there, she went with. And so it's that kind of connection. And I think she's just, and now they're at the point where they're all friends. She's very close with the family, but I think it just speaks to her as a person and her wanting to take care of her patient as best as possible.
Yeah, and that dedication shows up. I know she traveled back like the following weekend from Texas, I think, and then down to San Antonio. And just that amount of travel, you don't hear about that with team physicians very often. I know they have a staff and there's a group, but it kind of gets passed off probably due to the significance of the injuries. But this one is really interesting. And for those who haven't heard of a spiral fraction, it's fairly often in the athletic world, but can you give me a rundown? I know they had two classifications, first the fracture, and then what you were referring to about it actually resembling more of a military injury.
Yeah, so the fracture itself, as you said, is spiral fracture. You see it with torsional injuries, but it's a high energy type of fracture. So the kind of injury he had, you might see in car accidents, and you would see it in football. Football is a collision sport. Again, big bodies, high speeds, and the physics will tell you that the bones are going to be vulnerable. And the torsional part is what makes the corkscrew of the spiral fracture. So I think a lot of people think fracture and they think a break like across the leg, like something you'd maybe see on TV. But as you saw in this piece, we were lucky enough to have the CAT scan image available to us in the piece, and you could see it rotating, and you saw the fractures in just one spot. It's really all around the leg, and it traveled from his ankle virtually up to his knee. So you're talking about the entire length of the bone and the complexity of the fracture. Unfortunately, the side effect of that fracture was that one of those fragments punctured the skin, and that created the open wound, and there was the entry for the infection. And the minute you have that kind of complex fracture, contamination, and then the subsequent infection and the debridement they had to do to address the infection, where they removed dead tissue, and that's why his leg was so compromised. At that point, all of those factors together are what made it very similar to a military injury. Talking with Johnny Owens, who you saw in the piece, he was the physical therapist who was working with Alex, and he used to head up the physical therapy services at the CFI. He's still in San Antonio, but is now actually working in his own business related to blood flow restriction training, which all the NFL teams are using now. But he was saying that these war veterans, the tibia, which is the shin bone, was the most injured long bone of the war, and it started when troops were on the ground. IEDs, and if they would step and it would blow up through their leg, essentially you're getting these kind of complex fractures, open wound, contamination for sure, and then subsequent debridements. And so even though the mechanism is different, the nature of the injury between the bone injury, the contamination, and the soft tissue consequences was very parallel between what Alex suffered and what the war veterans have suffered.
And I think when you work like with Wounded Warriors that I work with, you see that kind of soft tissue as really the most visible sign outwardly of those type of injuries. And that debridement, I think, is really what took it to that level, right? And that was chasing down the infection itself, correct?
That's true. So they had to go in when they knew the leg was infected. They had to go in the first day. They remove everything that they can see. They flood it out. They are infusing him with antibiotics. And then they've got to go in the next day and look again. And every day, that was what was scaring them those first few days. Every day they would go in, there was more tissue that had become necrotic, more tissue they had to remove. And it was also tracing up the leg. And, that's where the question about amputation came into play, because if it starts to get too far up, is it just going to keep traveling? And then you're really running the risk of him losing his life. So by the time it was said and done, luckily they didn't have to amputate, and they got control of the infection. But in the process, all the layers of tissue that were removed left him with a leg that was less than what it was prior to the injury.
Now, by removing that tissue, that's really the turning point in stopping the infection, right? And being able to get ahead of it.
Yes. I mean, and removing what was dead, that and the antibiotics kicking in. They had him on the most powerful antibiotics they knew of. So it was really, they're fighting it on multiple fronts.
So you get to that point, and I love the term limb salvage. It's not what it used to be called, and I know that it's something moving forward. Can you explain to folks who don't know what the anterior compartment is and how pivotal that is to motion, and why that was such a key to making that limb salvageable?
So basically, the lower leg is divided into compartments, and you have this the anterior compartment really is the compartment on the front, and it's divided because you have fascia, this tissue that is very thin. But if you picture, I mean, not to be too graphic, but I think it makes it easier for people to understand. If you picture like chicken, and you skin and you have that thin membrane over the meat of it, that's like a fascial tissue. It's like membrane over the muscles, and it divides it into these compartments. And the compartments are pretty contained, where there's certain muscle tissue, there's a nerve supply, and there's a blood supply. And sometimes you hear in the NFL these guys who get lower leg bruises, like a shin bruise, and people think, oh, well, what's the big deal with that? I've bruised my shin. Well, if you get significant bleeding in one of those compartments, it can start to swell and put pressure on the nerve or the blood supply, and that can cause a limb-threatening situation at the very least. And in fact, after the type of injury Alex had, that's called compartment syndrome, that after the type of injury Alex had, the thing that they were on the lookout for immediately was compartment syndrome. Pretty common after a fracture like that with all the swelling that you get. Ultimately, that's not what he had, but when they went in, it was within that anterior compartment. So the muscles on the front of the shin that were the ones that were compromised by the infection. So the main muscle there is the one that controls pulling your foot up, ankle dorsiflexion, we call it. But it's basically if you were to point your toes to the ceiling, lift your foot up. And so it's very important for functional movement, because when you walk, in order to clear the floor, so you don't drag your foot behind you, you need the muscles of that anterior compartment to lift your foot so that you can take a step. If you don't have those muscles, your foot would drag and you would trip. So what's interesting is Alex doesn't have those anymore. I mean, those muscles are gone, and they don't grow back. Muscle tissue doesn't grow back, and the muscle transfers, people, if they saw the piece, saw that he had muscles grafted from part of his calf muscle in the back, part of his thigh muscle on the opposite side. Those are there to close the wound, just to give it closure so that the bone will actually begin to heal itself. It needs that soft tissue up against it to heal. But they're non-functional. They don't have a nerve supply. So his dorsiflexion is now essentially gone. And that means that he's had to compensate through the strength of other muscles in his leg. And he does wear a little assistive device in his shoe that helps him to clear the floor when he is doing athletic activity.
Okay, that was my question, is if the part of the calf muscle had remained with nerve signal to wrap around.
Part of it did, but essentially, which is why he still has some plantar flexion, which is the reverse. So if you're doing a heel raise, people think of calf raises like you do. So your calf muscle is made up of two heads, two parts. They took one portion of that gastroc or calf muscle and flipped it over to the front of his shin. And then they had to, the wound was obviously enormous. So that wasn't enough coverage. They had to then take part of his thigh muscle from the opposite side and lay that over there as well. So his calf strength is diminished because only one portion of the calf is there on the backside doing what it is supposed to do. But he has the wound closure, and that was critical because in the end, that's what you need the most, is that you need the bone to heal itself so that you can get weight bearing and develop functionality. And you sort of take the muscle loss where it comes and make adjustments around it, whether it's bracing or, again, strengthening a lot of associated muscles and what have you. But it's never perfect. It's never perfect again.
And I want to get to the piece about how he's adapting to that. But in normal injuries, I know that this is, I wouldn't call it common, but is something that we see in military injuries. Is that always part of the process? Is that the goal of a limb salvage, is to try to reuse or capture musculature that still has control from other parts of the body, like with this one head of the gastroc?
Again, now you're sort of getting into detail that's beyond my area of expertise, because it's not a group that I've worked with extensively. But from what I've learned, essentially the number one goal is close the wound and allow healing to take place. And then the secondary or sort of associated goal is to do that with minimally compromising what you have left. Is remember, they took part of Alex's quad, and one of his family's concerns, which was actually a really intelligent question on the part of his family, was what happens if you take part of his quad on the good leg, the leg that's strong and unaffected, because you're trying to make this limb salvage work. And then what if it doesn't work? You know, so you never know if the muscles are going to graft properly, you know, if it's going to take, if you will. And then is he left with this deficit on the other side? Now you've compromised the good leg to aid the involved one. And, you know, it's a legitimate concern. They felt like he would be able to have enough residual strength, partially because he was so strong and in such good shape as an athlete. The rest of his quad would be able to make up for that. But they also needed a muscle big enough to provide coverage. And so my understanding is that's sort of how this works, is that you're looking for what's going to do the best anatomically to give you the coverage that you need with as little compromise to the rest of you so that you can be as functional as possible going forward.
That makes a lot of sense. And overcoming that on both limbs then sets you up for where he is now. What we've seen, even on social media on his birthday, he put something in. It's not just simply ladder work. It's taking drops and getting out on the run. What surprised me to that was it looked like he had some control of dorsiflexion, that he was able to pick his foot up, put it down, and be able to get into a rhythm like a previous gait. Does that surprise you? Do you think that that's an adaptation more on the athlete rather than the repair?
Yeah, it's because I saw Alex when he didn't have anything. So I've been able and really fortunate enough to see his progression from when he first came home from the hospital to now. And every time I would see him, he would amaze me with what he's doing. So it's not like it was just natural. And, you know, I'm a physical therapist. I work with athletes coming back from a lot of different injuries. You sort of have your targets laid out of what you expect them to be doing at point A, B, C, D, and make adjustments as you need to. But in Alex's case, you never knew what to expect because there wasn't really a comp that came before him. So you knew and thanks to all the good folks in San Antonio, you sort of knew, okay, when we see this kind of compromise, this loss of dorsiflexion, this is where the problems tend to be. But I have to tell you, when we went back to San Antonio, and when you see that footage of him on the treadmills and all hooked up to the monitors, and they were doing all these assessments of him, they were blown away. And they see this all the time. So I took my cues from them because they were like, wow, we just aren't accustomed to seeing people make these adaptations. And this is no slight to, I mean, Alex will tell you, he was in awe of some of the military veterans that he met who had limb salvage situations not unlike his, who were redeployed and back in combat. And, you know, they're working on uneven terrain. They have to be able to run. And they have assistive devices that they have developed to assist them, you know, to help normalize their gait, if you will. But they have to still develop all kinds of strength, especially core strength. I don't think people realize how important core strength and glute strength becomes, because you can use that to propel your leg when you're compromised. So again, in no way is this to slight any of them, but just in terms of the way Alex had adapted to the specifics of his injury was not something they were accustomed to seeing. The amount of plantar flexion or push-off strength that he has in that leg, they were not expecting given his tissue loss, but yet he had managed to do it. It's really sort of a case study in mind over matter, if you will, because if you look at the muscle tissue volume that he's left with, you sometimes can't believe he's doing the things he's doing. So again, he does, you know, he has this little assist that he wears that helps him to clear his foot. In other words, it just doesn't let his foot drop, but it's not really working to give him anything. It's just keeping it off the ground. It's it's a very basic insert that a lot of people could use, you know, who've had neural loss. but it's a minimal assist. What he's doing, he's really doing on his own.
It's incredible just to see those clips, and going forward, now I can't discount anything that he may do in the future.
You can't.
And
I'm not.
Just, yeah, it'll catch you, right? Just your personal opinion, where he is here going forward, the legging that he wears, the black full-length legging, that's got to be both for compression, blood flow, as well as antimicrobial, protecting the actual salvage, right?
It does two things. It gives him compression, and it helps with like venous return and all of that, but it's also protecting his skin. Remember, he's skin grafted, he's out in the sun, so it's got sort of a dual function.
I expect that to be pretty commonplace, but having that on, I think maybe, like you said, protects his skin, protects the limb itself, but clearly any other injury, there's still always a risk, but he had the rod put in, which removed a ton of hardware, correct? It wasn't just the halo that was keeping the leg structurally together. Now he should be able to self-propel and stand on that rod, right?
I won't go into the amount of work of the hours of tracking all the medical records, but he had something like 27 screws and 3 plates put in initially. But when you have an infection, you have to remove all the hardware because it's compromised. And so then he was in that frame that you saw that was external. So instead of internal hardware, you have the external frame to hold the bones in place as they try to bridge and heal. And then when there's enough healing, that's why he was so excited. He finally got that frame off after about 6 months. But a little bit further down the road, they put in what they call the IM rod, the tibial rod. It goes down the shaft of the shin bone, and it's a titanium rod. So to be honest, the surgeons are like, they probably feel better that he's got a titanium rod in there, because this is what, other NFL players who break their legs, like tibia fractures, this is what they get. They get a rod put in their leg and it heals, and they come back in 6 months or so. And there's a lot of guys playing in the NFL who have titanium rods. So that's where Alex is now in terms of the hardware, is he has a titanium rod in his shin bone.
Okay. So that takes care of the mechanical risk of re-injury, right? And we know what he is in terms of dedication of his preparation. I mean, just your gut feeling, how do you feel about him trying to return to the field?
I feel everything that I feel like watching him and Elizabeth, doctors, I think they all feel that mixture of feelings, like you're in awe of the guy for what he's done and for what he wants to do. And you want him to have the ability to do whatever it is he wants to do. I mean, he's earned it. On the other hand, you think, if you're his wife, you're like, do you really want me to stay? Do you know what I went through for the last year and a half? And you got to kind of take a big gulp of air, like, we're going to take a chance on that again. And his surgeons, no matter how good they feel about how things are now, there's no way that they're like, no big deal, and still, I mean, final medical clearance to return remains. And we don't know that he would be medically cleared. There's several steps involved in that. So that would have to happen before he could take the field. But I think everyone collectively is looking at it like, let's just see how it goes. And I think Alex is too. I mean, he's certainly approaching this as, I'm getting ready to return. I want to see what I can do. And maybe, it's also doubly hard to answer this in the context of where we are in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, because you don't know when camps will be open. I mean, even now we're hearing different things depending on when facilities will open, when people can be working together, when teams can have organized activities. And obviously May and June were canceled. So does that then become later in July, and how much time is there? And so all of that ends up factoring into how this unrolls, because it's not like a typical off season. So I think with all that up in the air, it's really just a wait and see. But I don't think there's anyone in his camp, his team, his doctors, his family, that's counting him out. You certainly wouldn't if you had lived through it with him, because he's proven already that he's exceeded every expectation that people were hoping for, just hoping that he could meet these certain hurdles, and he's just blown everyone away. It's really remarkable.
I don't see how anybody could doubt the guy. And I thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk about this with me. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. And nice national audience. If you missed it, you get a chance to see it 4 p.m. Eastern on ABC.
And I checked, it's going to be on the 23rd as well. So. Oh,
good. All right. Well, we would love to have everybody have a chance to see it. It's certainly been, there's been it was a journey of love on our part, and we're very grateful that Alex and his family shared it with us.
Well, I'm very grateful to be able to see it as well. Thank you for all of your work. Folks, Project 11, check it out. It's on ABC a couple of weekends. You'll find it on ESPN as well. Stephania, thank you again.
And that's it. Great conversation with Stephania. Thank you very much. Again, if you guys like this, make sure you hit the sub button, the like button, click that bell notification. Leave your comment below, whether you're Redskins fans or a Chiefs fan, whatever. Great conversation about a guy that I think it really shows perseverance in a way that we haven't seen in the sports world for a really, really long time. So big takeaway. Kudos to Alex Smith and his recovery. I hope that it goes well for him. We'll talk about the future maybe in another show, but for right now, thanks for watching this one. Check these out as well, and I'll talk to you next time.